We briefly mentioned the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in the slideshow on U.S. environmental history. However, it's a very important law, so we'll take a little time right now to dig a little deeper. First, NEPA is considered by many to be our country's most important environmental law, and many countries and states have since passed similar legislation modeled on this law. Not surprisingly, NEPA was signed into law in the 1970s. Hopefully you remember from the slideshow that during the 1970s, which we call the decade of the environment, many important environmental laws were passed in response to the consciousness-raising events and publications of the 1960s. You should be able to list 3 or 4 key environmental laws passed in the 1970s. If you can't, go back and review. Interestingly, NEPA was the very first piece of environmental legislation passed in the 1970s, as it was signed by President Nixon on January 1st, 1970. Notably, Nixon was a Republican. It's interesting to note that during the 1970s, when all this environmental legislation was being passed, it had broad support from both parties. Here are a few links from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The first is NEPA's homepage, and the second is a very informative page that can be linked from the homepage, but it also contains the Citizen's Guide to NEPA, which is a readable document that describes NEPA and how it works. I encourage you to pause the video and go check out some of these sites. Next, why is NEPA so important? Well, first, it requires the federal government to consider the environmental impacts of a proposed federal action when making a decision about that action. This seems obvious today. Of course, environmental impacts should be considered. Well, prior to NEPA, there were no requirements to consider environmental impacts. The next obvious question is, what sort of projects fall under NEPA? Well, NEPA applies any time federal land, money, or permits are involved. The federal government manages approximately 1/3 of the land in the United States. So, with some exceptions, basically all projects on these lands fall under NEPA. Additionally, most large-scale projects, highways, flood control, etc., use federal funding, so NEPA also applies. Further, many states have initiated their own state laws modeled on NEPA, so even when the federal NEPA doesn't apply, it's possible that the state NEPA laws do. Okay, so what exactly does NEPA require? Well, if a project falls under NEPA, an environmental assessment must be performed to determine possible environmental impacts of the project. If the environmental assessment shows that the project will have significant environmental impacts, then a further study called an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, must be prepared. The EIS must address the nature of the project and why it's needed. It has to address the environmental impacts of the proposal, including both short-term and long-term effects. And it also has to offer alternatives to the proposed action that could lessen the adverse effects of this project. These environmental impact statements are really the heart of NEPA. They require the government to do a thorough study of what sort of environmental impacts will occur if the project moves forward, and then to also figure out some alternatives to lessen the impacts. NEPA also requires public comment be solicited when preparing an EIS. The requirement of public comment is very important. Basically, it allows the public to be included in the decision-making process. Projects can no longer be approved without the public's knowledge. The public gets to review the EA, environmental assessment, and comment during the EIS process, and also then review the EIS. The public is essentially the watchdog to ensure that an environmental impact statement is complete, thorough, and honest. If an EIS is inaccurate or not complete, there's an appeal process, and citizens can also take federal agencies to court to address the problems. This requirement of public comment is huge. Lastly, for our purposes anyway, Nepa established the Council on Environmental Quality. The Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, is within the executive branch of our federal government, and the chair of the council serves as the principal environmental policy advisor to the president. Among other things, CEQ oversees federal agencies as they implement the NEPA process, acts as a referee when agencies disagree, and reports annually to the president on the state of the environment. Overall, NEPA revolutionized environmental protection in the United States. Notably, though, it is also a law that industry groups try to weaken or circumvent at every turn. I encourage you to pay attention when you hear about NEPA in the news. Also, I'll admit I haven't been paying attention to NEPA over the last 6 months or a year or so. Is NEPA currently under attack? Likely. I encourage you to do some research and get back to us.